Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for February 21st, 2025. Well, we've had another week filled with high drama and some melodrama coming from the outflanked warhawks of the transatlantic establishment. It's actually been fairly pathetic to watch them as they huddle in Paris together to try to come up with some kind of response to events which seem to be slipping from their control. The fact is, they never had control. The Europeans have been subordinating themselves to the Anglo-American warhawks for many years, and the idea that they're somehow going to stand up to Russia, or that they even are legitimate in claiming there's a Russian invasion coming against them, it's laughable. Unfortunately, the people who live in Europe are subject to massive psychological warfare and censorship, so they don't fully understand this. Now, we had meetings this week of the U.S. and Russian officials in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. You had the NATO-EU gathering in Paris. And then you had, very interestingly, a number of meetings of Arab governments, with Egypt and Saudi Arabia in particular taking the leadership in responding to President Trump's request that if someone has a better idea than his idea of taking over Gaza, they should put it forward. And he's indicated that he's open to what the Saudis and the Egyptians are talking about as to a rebuilding of Gaza without expelling the Palestinian population, and in fact, moving toward a two-state solution. So this is all very interesting. It's moving quickly. And I did get some questions. The first one was actually a comment. And I want to share this with you to give you a sense of what we are getting from some of the people out there. This person writes, I think Trump brought discredit on himself and the United States by lying about the Ukraine war, saying that it was started by Ukraine, over $350 billion was spent, that Zelensky is a dictator. When you repeat this, Harley, it makes you sound like a Putin apologist. Well, actually, maybe it makes me sound more like a historian. Because if you review the evidence, you find that with the exception of the $350 billion figure that Trump threw out there, most of what he said is accurate. But especially the idea of the Zelensky dictatorship, because Zelensky is now no longer the president under the Constitution of Ukraine. His term is over. There were no new elections. The opposition was shut down. The opposition media was shut down. The Russian Orthodox Church was shut down. So the idea that somehow Zelensky is a great Democrat and patriot of his country, the lie is coming not from Trump or from me, but from the media that repeats this nonsense. So let's review some of the evidence of what's actually gone on in Ukraine. Much of this, I think a lot of you know, but it's worth putting it all together. Remember that this didn't start on February 24th, 2002, nearly 3 years ago. The real history goes back to the period of the breakup, the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. And at that point, you had an attempt to essentially destroy Russia. You had the post-Soviet NATO expansion. The promise there would be no NATO expansion eastward, and yet it's continued year after year up to the point of NATO troops on the Russian border. Secondly, you had the shock therapy policy, which was deployed against the Russian economy and Russian people, leading to a demographic collapse. They were told it was for their own good, as bankers and lawyers came into Moscow, grabbing parcels of land and industry and raw materials and leaving crumbs for the Russian people. That was the shock therapy policy. Jump ahead to the 2007-2008 NATO meetings where they took up the expansion, where again the Russians were told this is not about you, it's important that we have this kind of defensive expansion of NATO. Defensive against what? Now, then you had the 2014 Maidan coup, a regime change funded by the United States, including by the Agency for International Development, the International Republican Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, and George Soros, the regime change specialists who are operating from the U.S. government against Ukraine to overthrow an elected president. Where's the democracy in that? If you're going to say that Ukraine is a democracy, why don't you go back to when the new government came in 2014 and realized it was a military coup funded by U.S. government and private agencies. The Crimea annexation, which is often cited as an evidence that Russia was imperialistic. Well, Crimea for 2 centuries had been the main port for the Russians into the Black Sea. And the idea that you could suddenly take it away from Russia was just not acceptable. Besides which, the population of Crimea was predominantly ethnic Russian and rejected the Maidan coup. So did the population in eastern Ukraine. Now, these were Ukrainian citizens, but of Russian descent, spoke Russian language, and were part of the Russian culture and Russian Orthodox Church. They did not like the idea of a European Union NATO coup in their area. And when they resisted, they were met by heavy military operations from the Kiev government, including the deployment of neo-Nazi units, the Azov Battalion and others. Now, when the Russians protested this, they were told that it's not true. And they were told there were no Nazis. Now, who is saying there were no Nazis in the Ukraine Defense Forces? Well, among others, the Nazis themselves. They set up something called Stop Fake, which was one of the original fact-checking agencies. And they put out massive amounts of material saying this is just a Russian talking point, a Russian lie. There are no Nazis in Ukraine. Repeat that, no Nazis in Ukraine. Well, then you find out that as these Azov Battalion people were captured, they were covered in Nazi regalia as tattoos. Now, then you had the whole question of Putin's attempt over at least 8 years to get a recognition that Russia had legitimate security interests about their concern with NATO. And that was rebuffed by Obama and then again by Biden. You had the Minsk Agreement, which was supposed to stop the killing in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And instead, later, the French President Hollande and Merkel, the German Chancellor who signed it, admitted that they had no intention of stopping the fighting. They were just trying to buy time to build up the Ukrainian military. And then you had the sabotage of the agreement to stop the fighting in March and April of 2022, which was sabotaged by NATO by sending Boris Johnson there to tell Zelensky he'll get nothing if he goes along with this. So now, everything I've just repeated, are these Russian talking points or are they facts? You can find out for yourself, but you won't find out from the Western media. But what we're dealing with is a bunch of lies from people who are committed to the idea of breaking up Russia so that the unipolar order can remain in place even though it's collapsing. Now, a question that did come in, can Europe build an independent military? And what's the economic situation for Europe? It's a disaster. The sanctions policy against Russia has led to higher energy prices across the continent. The economy as a whole is suffering. The countries such as Germany and France are in some kind of turmoil and chaos over immigrants, over the cuts in spending on infrastructure, and so on. The idea that they're going to suddenly increase the spending for defense, or even have the capability of putting together a modern, upgraded defense sector, is a joke. What they've been counting on all along is the United States underwriting this and providing them with the material. Now that Trump is saying no more, they're going crazy. And they're turning against Trump, turning against the United States. when in fact the competent policy is to say, let's end this war and get an agreement between Europe and the nations of Eurasia. But that's not what Europe's thinking about, and that's where the crisis is. And the final question is about the German election. What do I think will happen? Well, if the polls are any indication, it shows a divided country. The probable winner in the popular vote will be Friedrich Merz, who is the head of BlackRock in Germany. He's with the Christian Democratic Union. Until recently, he's been a strong war hawk, although now he's backing off a little bit. In second place will probably be the Alternative for Deutschland, which is against war, against the Green Revolution, and so on, against the establishment. There's a chance they'll do better than expected, although I don't think so, because of the incredible animus shown to them by the German government and the German media, which means that you'll have, if Merz gets 30%, how's he going to put together a coalition? With the Social Democrats, which are still flailing under Schultz, the Free Democrats, and will probably not even make it into the government. They were part of the coalition. The Greens, well, Merz may have a choice between a coalition with the Greens or a coalition with the Social Democrats. In either case, it won't be lasting, and we'll probably be looking at a new election, maybe within even a year from now. So keep an eye on this site on Monday. Between now and Monday, we'll probably have an update posted. The election is Sunday, and I think it's important that you look at the links that I've posted today over the weekend to put you in the top state of mind necessary for dealing with what will be the avalanche of slanders and lies coming out from the end of the weekend, especially about the new moves toward a potential Russian-U.S. rapprochement. So have a good weekend, study, think, and join with us.